Hello and welcome to Highkey Obsessed. I am your host, Thomas Boomhauer, and joining me, as she will for every episode of the latest season of the best podcast on turf, she once struck back at lightning. It's Cassie from Sharkbait's Bookshelf.
Hello, hello. Struck back at lightning. I like that.
Yep.
That's
I feel like that fits.
powerful.
Today we have the pride, the privilege, nay, the pleasure of introducing our latest season, Highkey Obsessed, Toil and Trouble. Once again, shout out for the name to our girl, our number one buckaroo, Ivana.
But yes,
Yeah.
massive shout out to Ivana once again for this brilliant name. I love it. Toil and Trouble. And as you can see, well, no, I can't see myself, but I'm wearing my Girls Will Be Girls Witches
Girls will be girls
crew neck that my sister gave me for Christmas. I'm obsessed with it. I changed into it before we started recording because it felt very fitting.
It does.
It also happens to be the softest sweater I've ever owned. It's kind of insane. And
pretty cozy.
I don't know, it's probably just like felt, but it's so soft.
The whole naming thing with the semicolons, this is mostly just for me, but I think it is funny, is I listen to the Ringer podcast a lot, and they have one that has an ad all the time, and it's called 60 Songs That Explain the 90s. And I'm going to loop it back into us. So 60 Songs That Explain the 90s ended up doing at least 120 songs, if not more. So that's a little confusing already because they have at least 120 episodes.
Uh-huh.
So that was a running bit. And then now they're coming back for 60 songs that explain the 90s, the 2000s. And so that's like Highkey Obsessed, Addicted to Heroines, Toil and Trouble. And it's also like season 6 seasons in a movie. Who can say?
Who indeed. That's really funny.
So yeah, this season we're talking witches, more or less. We're going to be doing a little bit, things are going to be looking a little bit different around here than usual. And I do mean looking because you can see us probably. You might be watching us right now. So this is a video podcast on Spotify and YouTube, most likely. If it's not, you won't hear this, so who cares? All right, so this season, here's what you can expect. We have special guests planned. Maybe returning favorites, maybe new favorites. Who can tell? I don't know. We're going to be doing 10-ish episodes, maybe bonus episodes, or splitting some things into two parts if they go too long. We're not too hung up on formality around here or doing things any certain way. Here's the big change. Here's the biggest thing. So usually when I do a season, when I have done a season solo, and last season when you joined me, Cassie, we did 10 episodes, and there were deep dives into straight up historical topics. They weren't like thematic. They weren't anything. It was like kind of chronological history, just straight up examining what happened. This season, we're doing 5 episodes that are like that, and we're just going to be talking about specific witch trials. And then we're doing 5 episodes where we're diving into the thematic coverage of the topic.
Yeah, so thinking things like this episode, what is a witch? Thinking about, witches in pop culture, the Reformation, kind of larger, non-chronological, specific moment in history topics. Yeah. I'm very excited about those ones.
Things that touch on all of it and encapsulate all the witch trials, but don't really, if we were just covering them piecemeal, it would have been incomplete.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited about the new cadence and figuring out, kind of.
It also lets us be a little more loosey-goosey, a little more ad-libbing and improvising, so I think it's going to be good. I think it's going to be fun.
Which is much more my speed, so I'm excited.
Yes. Today's episode, we're not just doing the typical, here's what to expect this season on Highkey Obsessed. Though we are going to do a little bit of that. We're going to touch on that. We already have a little. We're going to talk about what is a witch. It's a loaded word that has been used to inspire fear, suppress power, justify violence, and continues to today. And so we're going to be talking about that, some of the sources that we'll be relying on. I think that's important to talk about when you're talking about history. Some of the inside baseball stuff, which is, I think, more exciting than it sounds when I say that. It's like how the scholarship and coverage of witch trials and witch hunts and witchcraft have evolved over the years, which is something I am very excited to talk about, and we'll talk about, I would imagine, with one of our planned guests.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. I think that'll be really interesting. I think we'll be able to tell pretty easily how, especially super recently, how very, very recent some of the areas of study around this have been.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't until, I think this is straight up true, that it wasn't until the 80s that the relationship between witchcraft and misogyny was studied.
Yeah, and even
it just wasn't discussed at all.
Yeah, and it was
crazy.
Yeah, and I know I have some thoughts on that we'll talk about throughout the season, but definitely today for sure.
Yeah. So, loaded episode. But before we get into all that, Cassie, can you please tell these fine folks where to find us and what to do once they do?
I sure can. You can find us at Highkey Obsessed Podcast on Instagram and Threads, as well as YouTube. And you can find me at Sharkbait's Bookshelf on Instagram and TikTok. And as always, you can find us on any of your podcast platforms of your choice. Please give us 5 stars if you like the episode. And if you don't give us 5 stars, Thomas, what'll happen to them?
If you don't give us 5 stars, we will. Listen, little known fact about me, if I need to, I can flame people, and I will do it.
It's aggressive.
It happened at work the other day. They were like, "Hey, go somewhere new." As my boss said, he was like, "Damn, you don't have to read us for filth like that." I said, "Don't poke the bear.
All
Don't
right.
poke the bear."
You heard it here, folks. Thomas isn't just the nice young man that we all know and love. He apparently can be savage as well.
I just choose not to be. I swallow the darkness. So, listen, folks. We know we beg you for ratings and reviews. Every podcast you listen to, they're out here begging for ratings and reviews. But the reason for that is whatever. I don't know why. It's stupid. But getting lots of ratings and reviews is pretty much like the only way to grow your podcast on the specific podcast platforms for whatever reason. It's like the best way to get organic walk-up traffic where people are scrolling through and your show's featured.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it's just super helpful. And also, you know what? Makes me feel good. I like to be complimented. I don't know about you.
I'm actually not great at accepting compliments.
I'm not great at accepting them, but I still like
literally.
them.
Well, that's true. I guess that's fair. I don't know what to do when I'm complimented. Literally, what do I do with my hands? Get me out of here, sort of thing. But yes, obviously, who doesn't love getting complimented?
Yeah. All right. So with that, let's get into some of our conversation points for today.
Yeah. Let's talk about why. Thomas, I like to have you start with this since you were the one that really suggested we do this, and it started last season. But why are we doing this? Why are we doing Toil and Trouble this season?
So I think the real reason, number one, obviously, is we had a great time doing the Addicted to Heroin season, and we're like, I don't know, seems like kind of fun. We got a lot of very positive feedback that was appreciated. Listenership skyrocketed, and it was just a lot of fun. And so as we were going through that, we obviously did an episode on the Connecticut witch trials, and I think you can relate to this. I'm not just interested in history or any other thing. Like, I'm all over the place in the things that I'm obsessed with. That's why I started this podcast, is because it was like, I want to talk about all the things that I'm into. And witch trials and witch hunts and the history around that, for whatever reason, it touches on everything. Like, there's folklore, which I am super into. There's anthropology, which I'm super into. There's history. There's, feminist and misogyny of it all, or feminism and misogyny of it all. Like, that's really cool from just a purely historical topic.
Yeah.
And so I think doing a full season on that was very exciting to me. And I'm going to be real. I did not think Donald Trump was going to be president of the United States right now. So I didn't think it would be quite as difficult as it is to do this, which, champagne problem talking to a mite about history. But when there's very real world reflections of what we're reading happened hundreds of years ago happening right now.
Yeah.
It's tough. It's tough. And it's also hard to be like, I have to focus all my energy, and I choose to, on staying alert and staying aware of what's going on, the evils of this administration, and then to dive back into ancient or to early modern Europe evils. It's like,
Yeah. I think that is a good point, and a good spot for me to pause us here and make sure the listeners know, we hope you stick around. We hope you listen. We will be talking about the parallels between what happened in the 14th through 17th centuries in early modern Europe as it relates to misogyny and the hundreds of thousands of women who were persecuted. across Europe and North America. We're going to be drawing the parallels to what's happening today in America and around the world. So protect your peace if you're feeling really flooded and inundated right
Yeah.
now with all the news and everything going around. Maybe pin this episode and this season for later and come back to it when things are a little less terrifying. We hope you'll listen to what you can and stick around, but we also want everyone to protect your peace and your sanity
Yes.
in these, yet again, these unprecedented times.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, not totally
I was
unprecedented,
literally
I
just about
guess.
to say, except that maybe they are a little precedented.
Yes. And like kind of on that token, it's like we're not going to hammer these modern parallels. We're not,
No.
I don't think. So one of the things, this is kind of more of the inside baseball stuff, but like one of the pitfalls I think of historians is they're sometimes, and I love historians, technically I am one, they have their heads up their own asses too much, and they're like trying to be so correct that they'll say something that's just so stupid, where they'll be like, well, not all the victims of witchcraft were women, so we can't say that it was misogyny was driving it. And it's like, I think you can say that,
Yep.
just for an instance. um and so like we are going to cover the modern parallels, but like obviously the focus of it is the history. And by that token, like we're going to call it as it is, but we're not like out here dunking on people either. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
we're providing true history. We're not like being activists by any stretch, but we're also not being like, fuck men or anything like that. Like
No,
just
for
being real.
yeah.
Another reason for this, and I think this is one of the more brilliant things I've ever heard. It's your metaphor of women's rights and women's history and like aggression towards women being sort of a tide,
Mm-hmm.
and how there's a modicum of advances, there's huge reaction, and it goes out the other way. And so
Yeah.
I think this early modern time period really captures a lot of that, because it's primarily when we're the period we're talking about, it's like it's the Renaissance, it's the Reformation. Like there's all this overflow of ideas and
Yeah.
advancement and like progress.
Yeah.
And during that time, the most like insane backtracking into fear and
Yeah.
superstition.
Well, I know we'll talk about this in the Reformation episode for sure, but one of my biggest arguments that I've made in multiple venues is that the Reformation was a response, was in
Mhm,
reaction to a lot of the cultural changes that were happening
mhm,
throughout Europe at that time. And I think, you know, when I talk about the tides of history, it isn't just about women. It is about that for us, but really
mhm.
it's for anything that we're talking about, right? That reactionary. And I was writing something about this earlier this week, that hopefully what we're seeing now, to your point about not thinking Trump would win, what we're seeing now is hopefully not an indication of the future of the country, but more like the death rattle of
Mhm.
a dying philosophy and dying culture. It's that last clinging on to power and existence, hopefully. And after this, it will all, be friggin' utopia, maybe. Who knows?
Hopefully. Yeah.
But I agree, and the importance that you and I have talked about a lot, about acknowledging the, you know, one thing that you hear a lot in studying history is that you have, and even in talking about historical situations, particularly when it comes to oppression and things
Mhm.
like that, is that, oh, well, it was a different time. Oh, well, you have to take things in the context of the time in which they happened. And like, yes, totally, absolutely agree with that.
Mhm.
And you can acknowledge that those things were bad even then.
Yes.
That,
Right, exactly. Like you can acknowledge that they were bad by the context of their day as well, often.
yeah, and even if it wasn't widely believed to be bad, even if it wasn't believed at all to be bad, you can
Mhm.
still say this was bad
Yeah.
objectively and in the context of now, while acknowledging the culture and beliefs of the time. But anyways, shall we talk about how we're going to, or I guess we already did kind of talk about how we're going
Yeah, I think we can
to do
skip it
this,
because we
but
covered most of
I think thing to note is that in general, and I mentioned this already once, is just the time frame roughly that we're
it. Mhm.
talking about. is the 1400s through 1700s. There is stuff that happened before the 1400s. There is stuff that happened after the 1700s. And in some of the thematic episodes, we'll talk about that
that whole stretch
whole
and
swath of
everything.
time.
I mean,
From
some
the
of them,
beginning of
including today.
time, from the beginning of time and history to now, there will be stuff that we talk about. But for the chronological historical events we're talking about, it is the 1400s to 1700s. And for even some of the cultural stuff, a lot of the content is going to be in that time frame. So if that's a time frame that you're interested in, we have got the season of podcasts for you.
We do, and frankly, it's not something I know a ton about, and I've been learning a lot in our coverage of this
Yeah.
because so fucking much happened.
It's funny because it is a time period that I felt like I had a pretty solid handle on, and I'm remembering and relearning some stuff, but there's stuff that I just like I'm full on learning for the first time here. Again, we'll talk about this in a later episode, but Scotland and the scope of the Scottish witch trials is so much bigger than I had ever realized. How late Salem occurred compared to the lifetime of
Yeah.
this witch trial moment, which I suppose makes sense if you think about the fact that these witch trials were happening in Europe before anyone white was even in North America.
Well, besides
No, literally.
the Icelands, not Icelands, the Swedes. There were the Vikings had, I forget which exact
Oh,
Nordic region had like
Does
full on
Iceland count as North
settlements.
America?
No. So they had settlements on like in Canada and Greenland and stuff.
Uh,
Like
in the
not they weren't.
1400s, in the early 1400s?
I think yeah, like super early.
Damn. See, I
They
don't know
were before
shit
Columbus.
about Canadian history. That is one thing like
So they weren't like full on colonies. They were like trade camp type deals, but they were there.
interesting. Okay, fine. Sorry. In what would become the United States of America. Better?
Fair. Anyway, so yeah, a very tumultuous period of history, and yeah, let's get into some high level background stuff.
Yeah. So before we get into the who's and the what's of witches, like I said, the time period that we're looking at is roughly that 15th to 18th century Europe and North America. But I also wanted to kind of frame out the scope of
Mm-hmm.
the witch trials and what we're talking about. And it is interesting because one, I think there's a record keeping issue. Two,
Yes.
there's a lack of reflection of this time period until the mid 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't a ton of study being done of the witch trials that happened until, not to say that they didn't happen at all, but just in the way that they're currently being studied, and trying to find, no one was trying to find the stories of the witches. No one was trying to document what happened, who they were before they were accused and how many of them actually even died. So to kind of highlight that, I'm going to share two very different stats. So there's an article in 1980 in the American Journal of Sociology that from the 14th and through the 14th and 17th centuries, between 200,000 and 500,000 people were executed as witches across Europe. Modern estimates put this closer to 40 to 60,000 executed, and then others show around 100,000 executed. Now, again, this is across Europe, so part of the problem is, of course, that you're pulling information from, I looked at a table of the deaths in the 18 countries that had the highest volume of witch trials across Europe. And, the Scottish witch trials, there was somewhere between 1,500 and one estimate showed, 4,000 to 6,000 women or people killed. So it's all over the map, frankly.
The other thing that complicates it, I think, is like as we'll get into in later episodes and maybe today, is people who are like executed as part of the witch trial, but are for like heresy, things like that.
Yeah, well, and that's
And
one
like
thing
depending
that
on if historians like reflect how they reflect it.
And that's, yeah, so we were what you talked about earlier about the way historians have like changed how they talk about it, and like the different kind of views about the history of witchcraft is
Mhm.
interesting too, because some historians will have almost deliberately downplayed the number of men killed in witch trials by saying that they were executed as heretics, not witches. But
Mhm.
in reality, like, witchcraft was a form of heresy at the time. So, like, it is, there's something interesting in that as well. That, like,
Yeah.
it would be interesting to see, like, how many of those heresy deaths were men to kind of, like, and that historians were sort of trying to, like, widen the divide between men
Mhm.
and women in witch trials even further than they already are. But in Male Witches in Early Modern Europe was an article that I read, and they cite
Mhm.
Brian P. Levack, who I'll be citing repeatedly throughout this because he wrote
Yes.
kind of the book on the subject.
Yep. It's on its fourth edition in like 26 years, or what is it? Yeah, 26 years, I think.
Yeah, which for such a niche subject, I think is pretty.
I think it's yeah.
But he states that in Europe, well, one version I saw said the British Isles in North America executed between 60,000, more than 60,000 people as witches from
Mhm.
1450 to 1750. I know there's another version that's the more recent version says around 45,000, with 90,000 being prosecuted. So again, all over the map, but it was a fuck ton of people.
It was a lot of people. I mean,
And
any of
the
those numbers. I
ton
mean,
of
if the
people were,
lowest is 40,000,
yeah,
that's a staggering amount. And it's, especially staggering amount for something that does not exist, something that is not real.
right. Right. 40,000 being the low mark, the low estimate of how many people were killed, not even how many people were
Mhm.
tried. The number of people
Yeah.
tried is astro-freaking-nomical depending on what sources you're looking at. It's absolutely.
Yeah.
But so I think we want to address the naysayers and the detractors right out the gate. And why are you only talking about women? Why are you only focusing on
Mhm.
the women being accused? And Thomas, you wanna kick us off in our answer?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think when you think of a witch, you think of women, right? And witch is technically a gender neutral term. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that kind of says it all. However, what actually says it all, and this is just straight up numbers, statistics, the low estimate of the percentage of women who were executed and accused of witchcraft, 75%.
Yeah.
I've seen that number as high as 85%.
And in Scotland, it's like 90.
Yeah, some of the places, like, it's 90, it's almost all women. And there are a couple specific witch hunts and specific countries where it is predominantly men. But in those cases, the number it's like 60-40 or 70-30. It's not that 90-10.
Yeah, I
I mean,
think
and there are exceptions, but like,
the one figure that I pulled from that table of the 18 countries with the highest volume of witch trials,
mm,
there are four places, and it's the locations are kind of interesting: Burgundy, Estonia, Normandy, and Iceland. Those are the four locations that had more than 50% of the executed
it's
being
interesting.
women, or being, yeah. It was, if you combine those four, the percentage of men executed versus women was 69% across the four locations. Some of them was like
Nice.
52%. But again,
Okay.
that is a majority. So,
Yeah.
and then again, by,
But again, like,
yeah,
in the cases where it's majority men, it's still much
it's a
smaller, even
smaller
though like the
majority
cumulative
than,
is
yeah,
69%.
versus, Scotland alone, like I said, 90%. And that is
Yeah.
like I said earlier, I did not realize, but Scotland was the longest running, the highest volume, just absolutely staggering the amount of, like, how long it went
Hmm.
and how many people were killed. But, you know, and we have a whole episode on that coming. But only
I mean,
10% of the more than 1,500 confirmed executions were male.
that's the other thing is like there are these famous witch trials and witch hunts, and they have books about them, they have Wikipedia pages about them, they have sources about them, and they tap out at around like these very intense witch hunts, even if they're years long, at like 2,000 people, 2,500 are high estimates at the most intense and brutal of these witch trials. That means there's just like sustained casual violence for
Yeah.
hundreds of years, because like the numbers get to 40, 60,000. Like, and if we're the famous ones only have, only in quotes again,
Yeah.
like a couple thousand, that means, and that also would give credence, I think, to the higher end estimates if there's not like these fervor around them.
Yeah.
And we touched on Germany. I don't know if we're doing an episode on Germany. That's the one kind of chronological episode we haven't locked down. We have one that we want to. I think it's fair to leave free because some of our best episodes last season were suggested by listeners. So I think it makes sense to leave that one free.
Yeah.
And we have we're either doing one of two things. We're gonna keep close to the vest for now, anyway. But Germany was just like fucking crazy, and that made sense because like arguably the heartland of the Reformation, right? There's a lot
Yeah.
going on. There's a lot of politics in what is now Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, that whole
Mm-hmm.
area. And so
Kettle
I'm
of
going to
fish.
quote, yeah, I'm going to quote from The Real History of Witches and Witch Hunts, which was like a podcast and lecture series by a Canadian professor from Oxford, I think,
Hmm.
Thomas A. Fudge, which Cornelius Fudge. I will
And
say
I'm
one
drinking
of the
out of
things that
my
I think we're going to do
Harry
a good job
Potter
of
mug.
is like we don't like we rely on the historians for their sources, but we I think know enough to be dangerous and to like critique and be like, I don't know about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't give like a blanket rubber stamp to his series of lectures. I would say overall they're a very fair coverage,
Mm.
but I think he does fall into that trap of being too fair and like being afraid to say something.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So anyway, he writes or he says a chronicler writing about the town of Waffenbüttel in 1590 said that the place looked like a small wood from the number of stakes that had been erected.
Oh God.
Because in Germany they were burning witches alive, I believe, right? And everywhere else they were usually strangling them first.
In Scotland specifically, they strangled them and then burned them. But yes, in Germany and Denmark, etc., I believe they were
Mhm.
burning them at the stake.
He continues in 1631 near the city of Cologne. One traveler wrote that they'd encountered a horrible spectacle in their journeys that outside of the walls of many towns and villages, they saw numerous states to which poor, wretched women were bound and burned as witches. And that's, just one random traveler's log, right? But
Mm-hmm.
he, and this is a man writing in 1631, went out of his way to say poor, wretched women
Yeah.
outside the many towns and villages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, and we do this will be brought up more in more detail in our next episode, but the root document for most of the world's witch trials during this period, so like after 1500, was the Malleus Maleficarum, is almost entirely about women. I mean, they talk about in it all the good traits are associated with men, all the bad evil traits are associated with women.
Mm-hmm.
The name itself, Maleficarum, is literally gendered female Latin. So
And I mean, so very important to note frequently that the Malleus Maleficarum, Carum?
Maleficarum is how I would say it, but who the fuck knows?
Maleficarum, the author of that, Heinrich Kramer, was considered extremist, both in his like religious views for the day, amongst others of the Dominican order, and the other inquisitors of the Inquisition. He also was notably considered extremist in his views of the evil of women. Like he was
Mm-hmm.
a known freak. People were like, I think he has some issues going on. I question
He's
his
got some
sanity.
mommy issues for show. I do want to asterisk when we talk about inquisitors, unless we specifically are talking about the Spanish Inquisition,
Mhm.
we're talking about general inquisitors, and that they are, while they have the same name and the same profession, quote unquote,
Mhm.
it is different. The Spanish Inquisition was much more similar to the witch trials that happened later. So
Gotcha.
many of them
Important
probably
note.
took a page from good old Cromer's book, although interestingly enough. I wonder how those timelines line up actually. Yeah, because Cromer was before Mary, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, anyways. I digress. And then finally, one of the reasons we're focusing on women specifically and not going to be talking a ton about the male witch victims, that we
Mhm.
won't talk about them at all. There's a couple of note that we will reference, is that, as I mentioned before, the kind of back and forth push and pull of historians documenting this time period and this phenomena throughout history is, until recently, as with so much of our history that we talk about, male dominated. And there have been several male historians throughout history, throughout the study of witch trials, that have indicated or literally straight up said that women themselves were somehow responsible for the accusations. There's a historian, Eric Middlefort, who wrote that, quote unquote, women seemed somehow to provoke an intense misogyny at times. And that they essentially, like especially single women outside the control of men, brought the scrutiny upon themselves by not behaving. Anne Barstow, who's also a historian, a woman, wrote of the arguments of these male historians, and again, you can sort of see this pendulum swinging maybe a little too far in the criticism versus what they
Mhm.
say. But I mean, I think there's validity to it as well. But she writes that the arguments that misogyny and patriarchy had nothing to do with the fact that the vast majority of the victims were women would be like arguing that anti Semitism had nothing to do with the fact that the vast majority of Holocaust victims were Jewish, and that by not acknowledging the cultural cause of the persecution, the implication was somehow that it was natural at that time for that particular group, in this case, women or Jews, it was natural for that group to be persecuted, and it was somehow their fault. Which, as we know, is of course ridiculous that it was women's fault that they were being accused of witches, and ridiculous that it was Jewish people's fault that they were all
Yeah.
killed in the Holocaust. So I think that's I'm getting a little worked up here, as you can tell,
Yeah.
but I think
I would also
worth
say I've
noting.
seen kind of more, I think more in the vein of historians being afraid to say something more so than being afraid of being intentionally misogynist, is arguing that witch trials are also an example of agency of women, as they like named others of like women acted as accusers. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like,
It's so insane.
under duress, my dad,
Like,
like you're
bro,
missing
have you
the
not
point.
read the descriptions of the torture?
Yeah. It's like, okay, so because they also like took advantage of the fact that they were on trial, and could like some women did like target personal enemies or like do things. Okay, so we can just say, oh, because that's the tiny percentage of women did
Yeah,
maybe stake out something.
I was thinking about
That
this earlier in the
it's so
context
annoying.
of like people will use the argument or will use like an example of a woman doing something bad, right? Or a woman living within, like acting and behaving within the bounds of the patriarchy, right?
Hmm.
But it's just that it's a woman. They're like, well, that can't be misogyny because it's a woman that did it. I'm like, that's
Hmm.
insane. Women can be misogynistic. It's called internalized misogyny. Women can absolutely operate within the patriarchy and use it to their advantage and advance their own lives and careers. That doesn't mean it's not patriarchy. And so, to me, the argument that it's not misogyny, it's not patriarchy, and like, well, women, blah, 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 is just always
Sorry.
going to be an invalid argument.
It's like the a lot of the logic from the theologians that were persecuting this was like, women are evil because Eve was evil because she gave in to sin. Thus, women can. This was also like a hey yo moment for me. It was like women can lure men to sin with their tongues. I was like, hey yo.
Hey, well, one thing I also kind of similarly to like the women can be misogynists, it's kind of note to me at least that many of the male accused witches
Hmm.
were that weren't accused because of their relationship to a female accused witch, right? Like I think there's
Yeah.
two different groups really. They were educators or loners. So one could argue like not the educators necessarily, but the loners, that they weren't. behaving or presenting in the like culture within the cultural norms for a man.
Mhm.
So that's still patriarchy, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, it's like rooted in the power structure and upholding
yeah,
all that.
exactly. So that's why we're
And
doing that this season. That's what it's all
yes,
about.
yes. And like, I mean, last season was explicitly we're covering women's history, women in history, topics about women in history that were not contextualized as such, right? In the Connecticut witch trials episode, and probably other ones, if if there was a man on trial, I didn't skip over that. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like, and we're gonna do the same. Like, if there's in the course of these witch trials, if there is a man who is more like relevant, we will bring him up. And it's not just like the ones that are persecuting the women. Like, if there's a male witch on trial and it's relevant and like worthy for inclusion beyond the fact that he's a man, we will bring up his particular story.
yeah, for sure. So with that, Thomas, shall we talk about what is a witch? And actually,
Yes.
first, can I tell everyone where the name for today, the title for today's episode comes from?
Yes.
So, for those of you on TikTok, specifically on Witch Talk or Book Talk, you likely are already familiar with the song W.I.T.C.H by Devin Cole. It was a TikTok creation, and it's W.I.T.C.H stands for Woman in Total Control of Herself. So, obviously, when we started laying out the plans for this season, I was like, immediately, name of one of the episodes has to be.
There's also, so I learned this when I was like researching what is a witch, and I was like, what is the meaning of the acronym? Like, where does it come from? Things like that. In the late 60s, there was what I'm assuming, and I think rightfully so, was a militant feminist group called Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. Shout out.
Wait, I like that even more.
They also, sometimes it was women inspired to tell their collective history,
Okay, I
or
like that
women
too.
interested in toppling consumer holidays. That's funny. They were socialist feminists.
No more Valentine's Day, guys.
That's so fucking
Sorry.
funny.
Oh, that's fucking hysterical. Wait, say that one again. Women
Women interested in toppling consumer
in
holidays.
toppling consumer holidays. I mean, that's great. One thing that bothers me about woman in total control of herself is the of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel you. But listen, shout out. Is it Devin Cole?
Devin Cole, yes, and I
Shout out.
love that song. I listen to it all the time. It's on my girl power playlist. I think it's
So
called Feminine Rage. Actually, is the name of
I
it.
do think like that does kind of perfectly encapsulate it, like who does fall victim to which accusations, unfortunately,
Yeah.
but not always.
No.
And so let's get first of all, ostensibly, in theory, a witch is someone who causes harm to others by mystical means.
Yes, that is the I'd say the hallmark version, the hallmark
Yeah,
definition of a witch, right? I'd argue that before 1400,
you would correctly argue what you're about to argue, I think.
that yeah, so prior to the 15th century, but even earlier than that, really, prior to the 14th century, or wait, no, yes, prior to the 15th century, so the 1400s, witches weren't necessarily people weren't necessarily claiming that witches inherently were bad and causing harm,
Mhm.
right? They were healers, and
Even the
they're
church thought that as well. Like they were either like depending, their mileage would vary,
yeah. I
person to
don't
person.
necessarily
But it was like,
know.
didn't they think they were just tripping? Like they were like, you're just an idiot. Like you're crazy.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it kind of depended on the situation. I think with the church, and there were periods of time before the 1400s that the church would get more. There would be more of a crackdown on witches,
Mm.
but for the most part, I think the Catholic Church at this time like ignored the kind of like the hedge witch
Ah, yes.
as part of, they were just seen as part of the community providing a service. There were instances where they would crack down on witchcraft. I think it was mostly if, for example, a a witch, a healer in a community was getting more,
A little too much shine.
more screen time, more whatever than the
A little too
priest.
much attention.
A little too much attention taken away
Or like
and taking away the potential business from the church by people praying
Yep.
for miracles, etc.
And from doctors, male doctors,
Male doctors,
medical
I'd
practitioners.
imagine, would probably be submitting complaints every now and again about witches taking away their business. Yeah, probably. Although I'll admit that like that's not an area I'm particularly familiar with, but
I've I've seen it like anecdotally in various readings, but nothing
yeah.
like
But it really wasn't until, and again, we are going to talk about this so much in an entire episode about it, and I cannot wait. But it wasn't until the Reformation and the repudiation of anything mystical, which to the Reformers, that was Catholic. The Catholic Mass and the mysteries therein, that was mystical and like magic and anything with unexplained power after that and during that time period was demonized. So, anywho.
Yeah, typical targets included older women who lived alone, perceived promiscuous women, or
Mm-hmm.
actually promiscuous women, shout
Or
out.
actually promiscuous women. Yes, there were plenty of those queens.
Those deviants. Outspoken women.
Obviously. I would have been so fucked.
Helena? Yeah, you'll learn more about that. Next episode, listeners, lock in.
If you will.
Educated women. Again,
Again,
we'll learn more
Helena.
about that next episode,
Yes.
and on and on and on.
Mm-hmm. And the one we're going to hear the most about, as far as the individuals, the most people's stories that I think we get a snapshot into are the midwives and the healers. And midwives are specifically called out in the Malleus Maleficarum.
It's I
It's
mean we
fucking
talk about it
insane.
repeatedly, but it's so insane, and like it rolls into the when women have agency versus when they don't, or like when they are trusted in society versus when they're not, and it's like so much crazy shit.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on what country you're in, Protestants and Catholics.
Yes. Depending on what country you're in, who's the ruling person at the
And in the Holy Roman Empire, probably depending which town you're in.
all that stuff. Yes, and listeners, I hope you will appreciate that the last note on this list is ... Catholics, said in the style of and none for Gretchen Wieners.
I think I kind of did it.
I think so.
I did all right.
I think you did great. But yeah, the ones I'm the most excited to talk about are, for obvious reasons, the outspoken and educated women. What was that?
Catholics.
No! I mean, I am really excited to talk about the Reformation, but that's actually talking about Protestants, not Catholics. But in terms of who's to blame, but no, I'm the most excited in terms of like the women who were accused of witchcraft. You know, the individual people and stories that I'm the most interested in talking about are the kind of the outspoken, educated women, and then the midwives and healers, because I think it is so. It hurts my heart a little bit to think about these people, you know, the older women who lived by themselves as well, whether they're widows or never married or anything. That's obviously very sad. Just thinking about, you know, your little old granny being fucking tortured. But the midwives and healers, you know, doing a public fucking service, and then something maybe goes wrong, a baby dies, a wife dies, or nothing goes wrong and they just decide, you know, a doctor decides that it was witchcraft or whatever, and then they end up being killed for it. It just really fucking sucks. So I'm most excited to give Senate kind of a spotlight to those ladies.
Yeah, and especially because it's important for both of us, I know, to highlight the people in history, and especially when it's marginalized people, and in this case, mostly women. And because, like, you hear 40,000, 60,000, 100,000, 500,000 people, like, you can't picture that. It's, you know, a basketball stadium worth of people was killed. You know, it's a lot of people. But when you get the stories, I think it's important for us to really highlight those victims, and especially, like, they're very grim stories most of the time, because most of the time they, you know, no matter how intelligent, outspoken, or educated the woman is, it ends with her losing her life. But being able to highlight their power when they had it is important, and kind of the only bright spots in a lot of these episodes.
Yeah, for sure. Well said.
Once in a while they do win. Thank you. Another thing, and this I added late to the notes, and it's because I was listening to it in the aforementioned Thomas A. Fudge lecture series is he focused a lot on how deviants. So, and it was like deviants, it were people who were deviating from the church.
Ah,
And that should depend which country, which territory you were in as the Reformation was going on. So that was like, and then it expanded to like nonconformity with social beliefs, religious beliefs, all the things we got into above as well. And so it's like being different, being other is what could lead to an accusation a lot of time.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that ties in even, that's where the tie-in with not just women are the ones being killed, right?
Hmm.
It's anyone who doesn't fit within the prescribed norms for that culture.
Yeah.
So it's a catch. The
And
witch is really a catch-all. It's a catch-all for anyone who doesn't subscribe to whatever the society has deemed as normal.
hmm and it's something that has continued from the early modern period, even if it's occasionally borne other names. Sometimes it doesn't. And, it's not always used correctly, I will say. And some of our notes are going to talk about in a couple minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, the mentality that led to these witch hunts is prevalent today. I think
Yeah.
it's amplified by the siloization of the internet and communities and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why it's also important for us to talk about it today and why we will be making those parallels to today, because it's reflected. We're seeing it, and it's not, we're seeing it is what I will say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, I will say sometimes it will be the fun time kind of history where we talk about witch hunts by their names. And I'm going to leave this in the episode because I would like listener feedback. So if you're listening still, let us know if you would be interested in this. Because we're doing video, I thought it'd be a good idea to do maybe like a short series on either topics within these topics that don't have enough, or we don't have enough time to do a full episode on. So, or like witch hunts by other names. So talking about things like werewolf scares or vampire panics,
Mm-hmm.
which,
Which
kind
the
of fell
fact
into
that that
the
even
genealogical thing.
exists, vampire
Listen,
panic.
there was a New England vampire panic, I think, in the
I
1800s,
would
which is
love a
out of
vampire
line.
panic to happen now.
I mean, Twilight, right? That when I was when was that, 2011 on?
Please don't tell us how old you were then. It's just gonna offend us.
Moving on.
Yep.
There's also like, so yeah, listeners, tell us if that is something you would be interested in. We'll probably do at least one to see how we'll see what we see, but let us know.
Yeah. What would you say is the best example in modern times of the witch hunt mentality that we're talking about?
So I think the most famous example, which I know isn't quite what you asked, I think the most famous example, and it's like almost a one to one because like a one to one, at least popular perception wise, because probably the Crucible, and that's like McCarthyism and the Red Scare. I
Yeah.
feel like when you learn about Salem in school, they tell you about McCarthyism and the Red Scare. They like,
Yeah.
hey, don't worry, next year you're going to learn about this.
Be like, yeah, it
I
hasn't
remember
changed. Surprise.
they like timed it. I feel like in my high school they timed when we read the Crucible with when we were studying McCarthyism as well.
Mm,
But I don't. I mean, it's different. I don't know a ton about it, so I don't want to get super into it. But I think to me, I mean, I don't know. We're going to get into some pretty messy territory here, but I think we should do it anyway. If I think of like a modern example of someone, and this is one person, but I think is really like embodies a modern witch hunt or like modern being labeled a witch, is AOC, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez.
mm,
Because like you think about it, what is she? She's a well-educated woman.
yeah.
Her education is downplayed. They focus on like her looks. There's like a weird hypersexuality around her and
Yeah,
people
there
being
is.
obsessed with her that way on the right, downplaying of her intelligence.
As
But
as
like,
someone who's not a New Yorker, but who fucking loves AOC and has from day one, I love her, and I think that that's an
I think
excellent call out.
I think we need her to be well, she's being a leader. I think
Her
she
be an
needs
actual
to be
party leader.
embraced as a leader. Yes,
Yeah.
she's matching the moment, meeting the moment in every way.
But I
But yeah,
agree
so
that,
like,
that the way that she is portrayed, talked about, vilified, whatever it
yes,
is, and what's the word I'm looking for? Not discounted, or I mean downplayed is a word that you use, and I think that that's fair. But just like just bashed constantly by right
Yeah.
wing media is an excellent example of the kind of rhetoric. And it's a different scale because, of course, they can't actually touch her.
Hmm.
But I think that's a great example.
Yeah, and they're like, there's a lot of coverage of like, there's the sexist coverage of her. Obviously, I'm pulling up notes I had on this from earlier that I forgot to copy over. You know, right wing people making fun of her intellect. There's literal witch imagery with conservative and further right pundits saying things like, if this were 1692, she'd be on trial. People say like she's casting a spell on young voters. AOC and her coven of socialist witches, bewitching the youth with free stuff.
Yeah.
She's,
Yeah, I hadn't even seen a lot of that stuff. So, like, I only ever see, like, the more, just hateful things, not the witch comparisons.
yeah.
That's interesting. If she was 1692, she'd be on trial. That's not something that you should want.
It's like
That's insane.
arguably a good thing,
Right. It's
like a compliment is
well,
what I
it's
mean by a good
definitely
thing.
a compliment if you're not
Right.
a fuckwit.
Yes. That's like just a specific person, I think,
Mm-hmm.
is could be comparable. I think another is like the witch hunt mentality is very conspiracy minded. It's very reminiscent of like QAnon and conspiracy theorists where like you can't present facts to them because they just move the goalposts or like they find different things. And
Yep.
so like it reminds me of a lot of QAnon bullshit with celebrities is what I'll say
Mm.
without getting too much into detail. But obviously, I think now brings to mind the fervor and bigotry around trans issues, trans rights issues, and trans athletes' participation in sports,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
like drag brunches, things like that. And really, it reminded me of transvestigations of famous people like Michelle Obama and how people are, there's like a whole contingent of people who are convinced she's a man.
Yep.
It like just doesn't make sense. And also, same with like Brigitte Macron and even like athletes like Brittany Griner, Serena Williams, Katie Ledecky have been
Yep.
subjected to this
Yep.
interrogation to their womanhood,
Yep.
and even like
Because they
because the
don't
right are,
because they don't look or behave like what this group
which
of
is
people think a woman should.
like saying that. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to be rude to the other two women I mentioned, but saying that about Serena Williams is insane. Like
Fucking bonkers. Well, I mean, it's saying
she's
about
like
any of them is
objectively,
completely
she's like
insane.
arguably conventionally attractive.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? She's like very like objectively beautiful. It's crazy.
I'm having trouble placing Brittany Griner's face, but
She's a
Katie Ledecky
WNBA star.
also adorable. It's insane.
After that,
I would like to clarify, not like that's not to say that a trans woman isn't adorable. It's just that
right?
the assumption or the accusation that these women are somehow transgendered because they don't fit the stereotypical beauty
And
standards for these people is insane to me.
it's mostly because they're dominating their sports as well,
That's
and that
exactly
and
right. They're saying that they're not pretty because they're intimidated by them.
yeah,
Just wanted to clarify what I meant there
yes.
because I realized that that could have certainly sounded a different way.
I will say I am. I don't think I am great at talking about trans issues, the trans community, but I do my best. So it's always intended to be inclusionary, and if I'm not, please let me know.
Yes, absolutely. We are not we're not above being called out and called in. Message us.
Yeah, just
Our
DM. Hey
DMs
man,
are
you're an idiot.
always open.
Don't be stupid. Say that.
I
That's enough.
wanted to talk a little bit about, and we'll probably talk about this in several other episodes, but the misuse of the term witch hunt, I also want to
Hmm.
touch on very quickly before we move on. You know, I think everyone listening is not unaware that some people use witch hunt and like, it's a witch hunt to
Hmm.
try and deflect attention
Yeah,
and to claim their innocence without actually lying and saying they're innocent, or sometimes while lying and saying they're innocent.
it's to like delegitimize the investigations,
To
which are ironic
delegitimize the
because
investigation.
it's like the same people who refuse to grant pardons to the victims of witch trials from hundreds of years ago.
Right. And I want to call it out specifically here because it's there's more to it than that. It
Hmm.
is doing that. That is the main motivation there. But by taking this thing that has been done to women for centuries, by taking this very painful thing that was done to women for hundreds of years, and
Hmm.
for a man to be like, this is a witch hunt, to get out of an accusation of something they did to a woman
Hmm.
is especially galling and especially dangerous that so many people jumped on that bandwagon, and should be concerning to everyone, because let me tell you what, there were men accused of being witches during these witch trials and witch hunts, as we have already discussed today and will continue to do so throughout the season. But the people claiming to be victims of witch hunts these days are definitely fucking not.
Yeah,
So that's all I'm going to say about that.
I think that's fair. Should we wrap with a quick discussion of the sources, or do we
Yeah,
have
let's talk
more?
about some of our sources, because I feel like we've found some really solid ones this season.
So I don't think this is even a comprehensive
Oh,
list,
God, no.
but we. I'm actually going to put this right up top. So, in addition to all the books and articles we're about to discuss, we're going to rely on innumerable articles from Rare Free Ad, JSTOR, our homies.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be articles that we're going to do our best to shout out, and when feasible, link in the show notes. Our source drop, because we hold ourselves accountable, but accountable, not accountable. Podcast episodes that we're going to be like, hey, shout out our homies at XYZ Podcast, videos, lecture series, things like that. That we will let you know where we got our information from when we can. But other than that, a lot of the coverage of this is going to be from a number of books that we rely on for all of these episodes going forward,
Mm-hmm.
or for parts of episodes going forward. One of the biggest ones is Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials by Marian Gibson.
Really good.
That's where I got the AOC idea. At the end of her book, she talks about the witch hunt, or the witch trial of Stormy Daniels.
Yeah.
And it just made me think, I thought AOC was a slightly better example of that, but that's hyper right now.
Yeah.
But that's an excellent work, and is a very detailed popular history of 13 different witch hunts, and brings in coverage of other ones as well, and makes it very easy to understand in a modern context without going too far into modernization.
Mm-hmm.
Another big one for me is The Witch, a history of fear from ancient times to the present by Ronald Hutton. He is doing a lot of witchcraft work.
All right. One of the ones that I mentioned earlier, and will definitely be citing a lot, is The Witch Hunt in Early Modern Europe by Brian P. Levack.
Mm,
He is cited in a lot of the sources, a lot of the
everywhere.
articles that Thomas and I have been reading on JSTOR cite his work as well. So he is really prolific in the field.
That's the other thing, is that this season especially, it's a lot more academic and scholarly history that we're reading, more so than popular history.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of referencing and sourcing one another from the sources that we're reading,
Yeah.
which is always cool. And I think we talked about it briefly before, probably off air, because this is boring. But after you've studied history, once you go to read a history book that doesn't have sources, you're like, this, I can't trust you.
Sus.
I do not trust
Immediately sus. I need at least, it depends on the length of the book, but I'm going to say 17 solid sources before I believe
you.
a
At least.
history book.
Or and if they're not I don't necessarily need footnotes or sources cited in line. But if they're not listed in the back of the book, that is super sus.
I'm a
I would
fucking
prefer also.
sucker for a footnote and an inline.
I
I love. I'm so weird. I love
I,
footnotes.
I put them in
Babel.
my
Have you
newsletter.
read Babel
Not
by
yet,
R.F.
but
Kuang? Because she has footnotes
it's
throughout the
there.
whole. Nice. He's pointing to his bookshelf if you're not watching this. There's footnotes throughout the whole thing, and I fucking love it. And a ton of people I talked to were really thrown off by it, and I'm just like,
I will
they were the funniest part. They were the best
put
part in some cases.
normalize footnotes in fiction.
Fuck yeah.
Also, the Rainer now does it. They used to do it when it was Grantland. They revamped their site and they have like inline notes that you can click and they will like expand. And sometimes it'll be like a joke, and sometimes it'll be like a whole nother paragraph.
I love that.
But yeah, and so I have those in my newsletter that I launched. That is free.
Oh, I saw.
You have to subscribe, and that's why I went with the specific service that I went with, is because they let you do footnotes. And I was like, we are so back.
Bet. Sold.
Anyway, I'm just gonna rattle through these, and how about and you just like let's talk more about that if there's anything relevant.
Yeah, no, you
Does that
got
work?
it. Go ahead. I feel like
Okay.
I've said what I need to say.
So, The Devil in the Shape of a Woman: Witchcraft in Colonial North America by Carol F. Carlson. That's going to be mostly for Salem, but there's commonalities it's important to understand as well. In Defense of Witches by Mona Chollet. The Basque Witch Hunt: A Secret History by Ian McKilson. For no reason. The Witch in the Western Imagination by Lyndall Roper. That's another, I think, kind of like seminal text right up there with the witch hunt in early modern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Male witches in early modern Europe as well. The aforementioned Real History of Witches and Witch Hunts, a podcast / lecture series by Thomas A. Fudge. That was good for like just a really basic overview of a lot of this and introduced new ideas that I hadn't seen before. Another one that I forgot to list that is on my bookshelf is A Storm of Witchcraft. I believe. Wait, and just look behind me now. Yeah, A Storm of Witchcraft.
Yeah. I've listened to a handful of podcast episodes since we started research. And I will say, like, a lot of the ones I've found have been, like, very heavy on, like, the storytelling, entertainment, mystical elements of it. So that's been kind of, while I love that shit,
It's
not been the most helpful for our purposes.
So I will say, I meant to say this when we were talking about why specifically we're doing this, because there's no shortage of coverage of witches and witch hunts and witch trials. Like there's popular histories of it, there's academic histories of it, there's podcasts, there's documentaries, there's everything. And this is a little conceited, but whatever. I think that we are really, really good at hitting the balance between like historical deep dive, where it's all very factual and very informative, but also entertaining. And I think the majority of podcasts, it's one or the other, where it's like a very cursory overview of history that is very funny and entertaining and engaging, or it's a very dry coverage of history that is not entertaining.
We're trying to
often.
hit that sweet spot, like the Dan Carlin sweet spot, right? Like,
yeah, and I would shout out
it's impossible,
Queen's
just
podcast.
in case anyone thinks that I think we're remotely as good as Dan Carlin. I don't, but who knows?
You know. But yes, I will shout out Queen's podcast, one of the
Hell yes.
foundational tomes for this. Great memes as well. And
But their
High Tales
meme
of
game
History.
is literal perfection. I shared one earlier today.
And then also Redacted History with Andre White are some of the better like deep dive entertaining podcasts I listen to. And Queens and High Tales of History especially were like, when I was thinking about what I thought our partnership would look like and how we should go about this, was those were two that I thought were good examples.
Nice.
So I just wanted to shout those friends of the pod out. But yeah, so like our sources, I think for the most part, are academic. They are nuanced and provide balanced coverage of it. It's not like ahistorical. They're not activist history. They're just pure straight up history. Yeah. And a lot of them skew towards after the 80s because of that ongoing historiographical changes going on in the coverage of the witch hunts. And a lot of these sources, talk a little bit about that, I would say.
Yeah. And, for even those that don't, and the earlier sources, like we've talked about before, you and I are both, I would not call myself a historian, but a lover of history, even though that is what I studied. But you and I both have studied history. So we're slightly more prepared than the average bear to read something that might include some author bias or cultural bias and be able to pick out the fact from the commentary.
Yes. But yeah, I think that's it for our intro episode. What is a witch?
Yes, a little bit shorter episode this week as we get ready to
Maybe.
dive into the meat of the issues with our first chronological highlight episode next.
And we're telling you guys next time. It's Helena Schäuberin and the Malleus Maleficarum.
Yes, I'm very excited for that one.
Me too. But before we can get that, we have to let the people know. Cassie, what are you Highkey obsessed with this week?
Oh my gosh, I meant to look it up. I just I literally was like typing what's the name of the new show on Hulu.
Oh, is it the president one?
No, B
Oh,
did start that and he stopped it. He's already over it.
damn.
It's the one about the like criminals in oh, hang on.
From the statistics.
No. What? What
The reference.
statistics?
That was just for me.
That was for you. Okay.
Mhm.
I didn't get it. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
New picks on Hulu. Is this it? No. God bless America. It's the show. Hang on. It'll come to me. It's like about the women criminals in London in the. It looked like Victorian dress, but I think it's slightly maybe later. But it's about. This is going to drive me fucking bonkers.
Let's see.
Oh. And it is. Oh, 1,000 Blows. 1,000 Blows! I am high-key obsessed with 1,000 Blows. I've only watched 30 minutes of the first episode and I'm already obsessed.
You're hooked. That's all she said. I've seen enough.
And it's because it's the creator of Peaky Blinders.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
That sounds cool. I'll check that out then.
And it's about, so it's like underground boxing, but like the ringleader of this criminal, like this crime ring in London, in like I think it's the East End, is a woman. And even immediately, like in the very first 30 minutes of the episode, she's doing something that is like really not good. And the way she's behaving, the way she's interacting with this other character, I'm like, that is literal. That's misogyny and patriarchy. It's just reversed. And it's one of those things where this is going to be this thing, this drum that I beat forever. Is like, women in charge isn't the patriarchy reversed. Like a matriarchy. Sorry. What I meant to say is a matriarchy is not just the patriarchy back with women in charge. The matriarchy is a completely different cultural structure. And this is another one. Like the Power is a book that kind of like underlines that like women in charge doesn't necessarily make it a matriarchy.
Got it.
Anyway, sorry, I digress. But I'm really excited about the show. I'll let you know in the next time we do this if I still feel the same way. But right now, that's what I'm high-key obsessed with. And the Mexican restaurant near my house that opened up like maybe 6 months ago. We've been, I think, 4 times, and every single time it has just knocked our freaking pants off. It's so good. And it's like proper Mexican food. Not that there is anything wrong with a Mexican restaurant that's really run by El Salvadorian, so half the food is El Salvadorian. Like, there's nothing wrong with that because I fucking love pupusas. But a Mexican restaurant that is like real Mexican street food is so rare around here. Anyways, if you live in Richmond, go to Maya's. How about you?
Well, as I'm sure you know, I got a new espresso machine.
I do.
So I showed
everyone
with espresso. I am very excited for it. I made what I am calling an avocado milkshake last night, which was basically like, a milkshake, vanilla, and a large shot of espresso.
Yum.
It was really good. It was really, really good. It basically tasted like coffee ice cream, but it was delicious. Quite good. I did the milk I was going to put in it. I used the cold foam setting before I put it in. I don't know if it did anything for the milkshake, but it made me feel good. So that's what I'm into. I'm also obsessed with this. This is kind of like a recurring obsession, but as we're recording this, they just passed their 20th anniversary. That is Avatar: The Last Airbender. Shout out Aang, shout out Katara, shout out Sokka, and shout out the goat Toph. And also shout out Zuko.
I'm afraid I don't know anything you just said.
That's okay. It's one of the times where the undisclosed age gap between us, it fucked us up because it's the first couple episodes, very much child, and I was in elementary school when that came out. So I was peak age for that. Like me and the boys, me and I think everybody we were locked in whatever day that dropped. Next day at lunch,
Mm-hmm.
we were talking about it. We were like, "How the
That was
you guys see Azula? I don't know how the Jane's dealing with her. She's shooting lightning. Like goddamn." Yeah, the lunch table was concerned Azula was a problem, but yeah,
Oh, I also forgot I'm high-key obsessed with. No one fucking told me that Vikings Valhalla had a season 3 this summer, so I started watching that also. And the Netflix Sabrina show. I'm like almost done with that.
what one?
Sabrina, but the Netflix version from like
Ah,
2018. Turns out it had 4 seasons, so I still have season 4 to.
no, ah,
It was good. It kind of, I mean, show about witchcraft. It's obviously going to get a
mhm.
little insane.
Can you spoil something for me?
Sure.
I don't know if this even bears cutting. Does Salem talk? Is there a Salem in this one?
There is a Salem in this one who doesn't talk, and it really fucking bums me out.
I just like I remember watching reruns of on like ABC Family every
Sabrina the
morning,
Teenage
and
Witch.
I was like, I don't like this show. I love Salem. Like I was just locked in. Anytime I was like, I don't care. I don't know what's going on with Sabrina. I couldn't tell you a single arc of any episode.
Oh, yeah.
Salem was hilarious.
I
Love
watched
that. Love
that show every week. I loved Sabrina the Teenage Witch. What's interesting is actually like they didn't. The casting of Sabrina isn't like she doesn't look like Melissa Joan Hart, but
Mhm.
the aunts kind of do. Like Aunt Zelda and Aunt, I'm blanking on the other aunt's name right now, but they do kind of look like her. Although it took me like 2 seasons to realize one of the aunts is Harry Potter, is Lily Potter from the Harry Potter movies.
I think that's fair.
I'm pretty surprised by myself that it took me that long. Not that I don't like the movies that much, but still, I feel like I should have recognized her.
You probably should have, yeah.
Anyways, I've been watching a fuck ton of TV because I just can't like make my brain want to read right now. It's too depressed.
I feel you. All right.
Anyways, that's
So
all.
on that happy note, be sure to check out the podcast on Instagram at Highkey Obsessed Podcast, on YouTube at Highkey Obsessed Podcast, on Threads at Highkey Obsessed Podcast. There is an email, so check that out on the show notes. That would be a great place to tell us if you hate us, because I don't check it that often. Also, be sure to check out Cassie's content on Instagram and TikTok at Sharkbait Bookshelf. All of those linked in the show notes as well. Also, while you're at it, look up the show wherever you're listening to us. Hop on, 5-star ratings, 5-star reviews. And if you don't give us a 5-star rating and review,
We will accuse you of being a witch.
Hmm.
In a bad way?
derogatory.
Yeah.
So until next time, remember, now, he's thinking about me every night. Oh, is that so sweet? I guess so. Say you can't sleep. Baby, I know. That's that me espresso.